The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up two bipartisan measures. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider today's measures en bloc. And so without objection, the following items previously provided to members and also in your packets will be considered en bloc and are considered as read. H.R. 1698, Iran Ballistic Missiles and Sanctions Enforcement Act, including the Royce Amendment 36 in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1698, Shabbat Amendment number 3, DeSantos Amendment number 57, Schneider Amendment number 2, Sherman Amendment number 30, Sherman Amendment number 31, Zeldin Amendment number 32, and H.R. 535, the Taiwan Travel Act, as introduced. I now recognize myself to speak on today's business. So today we consider H.R. 1698. This is the Iran Ballistic Missiles and International Sanctions Enforcement Act. It responds to the regime's continued pursuit of intercontinental ballistic missiles and dangerous conventional weapons. As we heard at our hearing yesterday, there is bipartisan agreement that we must continue to respond to the full range of threats that Iran poses to our national security and that of our allies and partners. That means going after Iran's support for terrorism, as we did last month, by marking up two strong bills targeting Iran's leading terrorist proxy, and that is Hezbollah. It also means targeting Iran's development of intercontinental ballistic missiles and dangerous conventional weapons, and that's what this bill does. It requires a comprehensive investigation to identify and designate the companies and the banks and the individuals, both inside and outside of Iran, which supply the regime's missile and conventional weapons programs, and it sanctions those entities. And I should note that we had an excellent hearing on Iran yesterday, and our subcommittees have had excellent hearings, for which I thank them. I appreciate members' concerns regarding the future of the Iran deal on both sides. This isn't an easy issue, but this bipartisan bill, which we have before us today with over 300 co-sponsors, this bill is not and should not be a referendum on the nuclear deal. I welcome the amendments considered in the en bloc that seek to strengthen this bill's impact on Iran's missile program. I want to add a note of thanks to the members on both sides of the aisle who contributed to this bill with their thoughtful amendments. To Mr. Shabbat, Mr. DeSantis, Mr. Schneider, Mr. Sherman, and Mr. Zeldin. As former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter warned, the I in ICBM stands for intercontinental, quote, which means having the capability from flying from Iran to the United States, unquote. There is no question that the U.S. must take strong action now to curb Iran's dangerous pursuit of ballistic missiles. So moving on to our other measure that we're taking up today, I want to thank Representative Steve Shabbat for authoring H.R. 535. This is the Taiwan Travel Act. Currently, the State Department enforces self-imposed restrictions on official travel between the United States and Taiwan. This bill denounces that practice by encouraging more frequent official visits, including at the highest levels, that will serve to further strengthen the critical U.S.-Taiwan partnership. This bill builds off legislation we passed out of the committee last month, which addressed Taiwan's exclusion from the World Health Assembly. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Elliott Engel, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Thank you for calling this markup. This has been a busy week, Mr. Chairman, as we all wait to learn what the administration plans to do about the Iran deal. This morning, we've got two bipartisan measures before us. And that's no surprise because this committee is accustomed to working in a bipartisan way. We think that foreign policy should be bipartisan and that partisanship should stop at the river's edge. And that's the way we've conducted ourselves during these past 5 years. But apparently the administration doesn't agree. We learned through reporting that last evening the President's National Security Advisor, General McMaster, and Secretary of State Tillerson briefed Republican members on the administration's plans. Policy towards Iran is of the highest national importance. We must stand together to confront these threats, and frankly, partisan briefings simply do not help. So let's get this right and stop the political games that the administration is playing. If the reporting is accurate, the administration plans to decertify the deal and push for Congress to pass legislation to change parts of it. I'm not quite sure how that would work. Congress has a role to play in foreign policy, but we cannot pass a law to unilaterally change an international agreement. If the administration wants to change the nuclear deal, and I'd be the first to say there are areas which can be improved or strengthened. I want to remind everybody I voted against the deal 2 years ago. Then the administration needs to work with our allies and negotiate. We can do this. There's time before areas of the agreement sunset. Let's put our heads together with our friends in London, Paris, Berlin, and the EU, and see to it that all pathways to a bomb are cut off for Iran in perpetuity. But let's do it right. Don't blow up the agreement to save it. We'll come out worse in the end. If the administration needs certain authorities, that's where we have a job to do. But this talk of decertifying the agreement and kicking it to Congress for some sort of magical fix just doesn't make sense. I wish I had more clarity on what the White House plans to do, but White House apparently feels that Democratic members don't need any kind of briefings. I'm frankly irked that many of us are being kept in the dark. That said, I'm a co-sponsor of the ballistic missile legislation, and I plan to support it. I'm ready to work with Chairman Royce to pass more sanctions on Iran, but I'm more curious why the tough sanctions law the President signed in August hasn't been put to use yet. We hear a lot of talk from the White House, but so far the only action when it comes to Iran is this plan to decertify the deal. I agree with my friend, the Chairman, let's enforce the hell out of the sanctions we have. So I'll support this bill, but I have a lot of questions about what the administration plans to do in the hours and days ahead. And again, I am concerned about legislating on Iran when only a few members have the full picture of what's about to happen. Next, I'm grateful to Reps. Shabbat and Sherman for their strong leadership on Taiwan, and in particular for introducing the Taiwan Travel Act. I'm a strong supporter of Taiwan. I visited there many times, including with the chairman, who has been a long-standing champion and highly regarded expert on Taiwan issues. Taiwan is a flourishing multi-party democracy of more than 20 million people and a vibrant free market economy. It's a leading trade partner of the United States, alongside much bigger countries like Brazil and India. Over the past 60 years, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship has undergone dramatic changes, and Taiwan's development into a robust and liberal democracy underscores the strong friendship our two countries share today. The cornerstone of our relationship is the Taiwan Relations Act, passed by Congress in 1979. It's been instrumental in maintaining peace and security across the Taiwan Straits and in East Asia, and serves as the official basis for friendship and cooperation between the United States and Taiwan. Congress has played a major role in defining what our bilateral relationship looks like. Given the possibility that the new administration may want to revisit regulations and guidance towards Taiwan, the Taiwan Travel Act is timely. This measure puts Congress on record saying the United States government should encourage more regular, substantive, and senior-level engagement between American and Taiwanese officials, and reaffirms that our policy should be to allow such visits to occur at all levels of government. This is the sort of engagement and support we would like to see for our close friends and partners in Taipei. That's why I support this measure, and all members to do the same. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this markup, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Do any other members seek recognition? Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As we heard yesterday in testimony from General Wald, the Iran deal, quote, places Iran on a trajectory to become an intractable challenge as an intractable challenge as North Korea is today, and possibly worse. The general noted that while Pyongyang's relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons has only deepened its isolation and driven it towards bankruptcy, the JCPOA is doing the opposite for Iran. It was clear, Mr. Chairman, from the beginning that this deal was deeply flawed. You said it, I said it, many members of this committee on both sides of the aisle said it. It was clear as well that it was based on a fundamentally misguided premise that Iran's manifest desire for nuclear weapons could be considered separate from its development of a delivery capability for that weapon or from the rest of Iran's violent campaign for regional hegemony. It should be self-evident that a nuclear warhead without a delivery vehicle is not going very far, very fast. Iran's ballistic missile program is inseparable from its desire to impose nuclear blackmail on the United States, Israel, and other regional friends and allies. Iran also exports its extremist revolution through the proliferation of conventional weapons to terrorist proxies. The Iranian nuclear deal, as we all know, gave Iran an infusion of an estimated $115 billion in unfrozen assets. And as John Kerry said in an interview that was carried by CNN, that we don't know where that money is going, and it probably will end up in the terrorists' hands. Not to mention other financial inducements like the $1.7 billion in small bills. As we heard yesterday, this money has helped Iran to extend its malign influence to an unprecedented extent across the region, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in Yemen. H.R. 1698, the Iran Ballistic Missiles and International Sanctions Enforcement Act, enjoys broad bipartisan support and has a huge number of co-sponsors, some 320. The bill expands sanctions against organizations and individuals that facilitate Iran's ballistic missile program, as well as its trade in conventional weapons. It's critical to our national security and that of our allies in the region, especially our good friend and ally, Israel. I yield back, and I ask unanimous consent that a full statement be made a part of the record.
Without objection, we now go to Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for bringing these excellent bills up. For 20 years, I have had a commitment to the security of Taiwan and to countering the threat of Iran. H.R. 535, I think, should enjoy the support of everyone here, and I've studied it as ranking member of the Asia Subcommittee. Taiwan has 23 million people. We have $85 billion of two-way trade. Any country near that important to us, we would have meetings at the highest levels of government. This bill expresses a sense of Congress that it should be U.S. policy to encourage government visits at all levels between the United States and Taiwan. Now, it's true that officials have traveled from Taiwan to the United States at various conferences. They've participated in meetings in the United States regarding the environment and global anti-terror campaigns. But when it comes to the senior-most Taiwanese national officials, we don't allow them to come to Washington. Taiwan's defense foreign minister and president have come to the United States this year, but not Washington, D.C., and not to meet in formal meetings in U.S. government buildings. There is only one beneficiary of this program, and that is myself and the 30th Congressional District, since it is a matter, since the place most visited by senior Taiwanese officials is the Sheraton Universal Hotel in my district. As wonderful as those meetings are, it would be much better if the meetings were at the State Department and here in the United States Congress. Encouraging greater level of high-level visits and dialogue, as mentioned in the bill, would ease Taiwan's international isolation and reaffirm the U.S. political and security commitments to Taiwan. As to H.R. 1698, the Iran Ballistic Missiles Act, this is an important act to make it plain that Iran's violations of UN Security Council resolutions regarding not only ballistic missiles, but also the transfer of weapons must be responded to, and that's why I'm pleased to be one of the 320 co-sponsors of this important legislation. Thank you for including my two amendments, the first of which requires the President to submit periodic reports on the illicit activities of supposedly civilian aircraft controlled by Iran? Are they using them to take material to Assad, to the Houthi, and others? Are they using them to move chemical or biological weapons? Are they using them for terrorist acts like they did in Bulgaria a decade or two ago? This is important because we're called upon to allow the sale of U.S. planes, supposedly civilian planes, to Iran. We should know what their existing civilian planes are used for. Second, it calls for the President to report after each missile test the technical details of the test, the trajectory, duration, range. I want to point out that some or all of these reports can be classified, and some portions clearly should be. The United States clearly provides the same information about North Korean missile tests that this bill calls on them to provide with regard to Iranian nuclear tests. Such information will provide better assessments for the capacity of these missiles and help Congress do its job. Finally, when it comes to sanctions on Iran, we need the toughest sanctions with the best explanation. Tough sanctions so that Iran gets the message. A good explanation so that Europe and Asia support what we're doing. That's why I'm pleased that this bill focuses on Iran's violation of UN Security Council resolutions dealing with missiles and weapons. The worst reason we could give is to say we're imposing sanctions to deliberately shred the nuclear deal. If we do that, Europe won't enforce the new sanctions and will not join us in them, and Europe will think it's fine for Iran to stop even pretending to live under its commitments under the deal. Equally tough sanctions imposed because of what Iran is doing in Syria, what they're doing for in missiles, what they're doing to violate UN Security Council resolutions, gives us a chance of international support and leaves in place the benefits that we do get, and we do get some benefits from the Iran nuclear deal. Finally, I would point out that in this room, several of us, including myself, asked Secretary Kerry in 2015, were we allowed under the JCPOA to adopt sanctions because of Iran's support for terrorism, holding our hostages, and supporting Assad? And the answer from Secretary Kerry is we are free to adopt additional sanctions as long as they are not a phony excuse for just taking the whole pot of the past ones and putting them back. So let us impose the sanctions that Iran has earned from its evil activities, and let's just make sure they pass the test of not being phony, and I yield back.
Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, and again, I'd like to thank you and Congressman Elliott Engel for the leadership on this issue. We've seen this committee on numerous occasions focus on what could be one of the gravest threats to the well-being of the American people that we face today. In fact, I would probably put it at the most important. We have an unstable regime. We have a group of religious fanatics controlling the Iranian government, and our efforts to prevent that, the lunacy that comes out of that regime from getting into possession of nuclear weapons is vital to the security and well-being of the people of the United States. So I thank both of you for keeping us focused on this issue. Let me note that 20 years ago, when I was here, I remember a similar situation when we were facing the possibility that a lunatic in North Korea would get their hands on nuclear weapons. And we went out of our way. We were assured by the administration that sanctions and incentives like giving cash would do the trick, and it didn't. The fact is, we have had sanctions on North Korea, and they did not work. The fact is, we gave North Korea $4 to $5 billion And not only did it not work, it probably facilitated their nuclear weapons program by giving them some other money that was then fungible to channel into the development, long-term development of a nuclear weapon. We've already we've unleashed $150 billion into the control of the mullah regime in Iran. These are people who believe that we represent Satan to them. The United States represents a satanic force in the world that needs to be wiped out. That's what they believe. We have to face that reality. If we don't face that reality, we're going to face the same situation that we face in North Korea today. Yeah, wishful thinking had us 20 years ago, and we facilitated North Korea from getting into this position. Again, sanctions alone will not work, but we should make sure that we move forward with all the things that we can do short of a military confrontation. Sanctions is certainly one of them. And the second part, however, I think we've got to bite the bullet and realize that in a nuclear age, we sometimes will have to take actions against governments that we would not necessarily want to disturb. We'd let them sit there. We'd have to take actions, and it doesn't necessarily mean sending American troops into action and into military confrontation. Instead, which during the Reagan years, I'm very proud to have played a role in developing what they called the Reagan Doctrine, which was go out and try to find out who the enemies of your enemy are, and then help those people to do the fighting for you. And in this case, Iran is filled with people who hate the mullah regime. They are oppressed by the mullah regime. Young Persians marched, in fact, 8 years ago, seeking our help, and we rebuked them. And instead, we should be reaching out to these young Persians who hate the mullah regime and want to live at peace, want to build an economy and not nuclear weapons. Let's reach out to them. Let's reach out to the Baluch, people who are oppressed in Iran. Let's reach out to the Kurds. There are more Kurds in Iran than there are in Iraq, for example. There are Azaris that feel they're oppressed. They are part of the same Azaris from Azerbaijan. We have people that we can work with there, the vast majority of people in Iran who don't like the mullah regime. If our goal is to stop this mullah regime from obtaining nuclear weapons which would threaten and endanger the people of the United States, we need to do sanctions, but we need to do more than that. But I join you today in doing what we can do right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and the ranking member for bringing these bills before us. I want to join in supporting the Taiwan Travel Act, which is an important statement of American backing for our friends in Taipei and for the values of democracy that Taiwan proudly exudes in East Asia. The U.S.-Taiwan relationship is an obvious and easy and important relationship to support. I'd like to focus my comments, though, on the Iran Ballistic Missiles and International Sanctions Enhancement Act. While we already passed into law the substantive provisions included in this bill when we passed CATSA back in July, I welcome today's markup as yet another opportunity to discuss the options we reserve for going after Iran's malign activities and for doing it without wasting time outside of the JCPOA. It's been more than 2.5 months since we sent the President additional authorities to impose tighter sanctions that would squeeze Iran's support for terrorists like Hezbollah, that would hold the IRGC accountable for its support to the Assad regime and its efforts to sow discord in the region, and to punish Iranian officials responsible for the well-documented human rights abuses against the Iranian people. Yet we still have not seen the President or this administration act to enforce these new sanctions. Instead, we've been consumed by the certification debate. And I oppose the JCPOA, but I also have spent my congressional career pushing the sanctions architecture that brought Iran to the negotiating table. I know that it was not easy to bring our international partners on board, and I recognize that in order to continue the pressure to pressure Iran, we will need the support of our allies and others on the global stage. I've already made my feelings clear about certification and the implications of unilaterally disengaging from the JCPOA. I'll just add that whatever speech the President may give today or tomorrow, I hope that it includes a comprehensive strategy for combating Iran's anti-American and anti-Israel posture in the region, and I hope that the President commits to use the sanctions tools that we in Congress have given to him. Because however we feel about the nuclear deal, we can certainly all agree that Iran must be held accountable for its blatant and consistent violations of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which forbids Iran from testing or developing ballistic missiles. The very fact that it is the IRGC that oversees the missile program, the same organization responsible for supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, and Assad, should help illuminate why the international community rightly is so concerned. Iranian aggression and the threat posed by its revolutionary leadership has always been a priority of this committee, and I'd like to thank the committee's leadership for your continued vigilance and attention to this issue and for bringing this bill before us today. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. We now go to Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this markup today, a very important one, I think. First, I'd like to voice my support for H.R. 535, the Taiwan Travel Act, a bill that I introduced along with my friend from across the aisle, Brad Sherman from California, introduced it earlier this year. I want to thank him for his leadership on this issue. As a founding member of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, I've had particular interest in U.S.-Taiwan relations. I think, as many of us do, take our commitment to Taiwan very seriously. I'd also like to quickly address the restrictions on visits by high-ranking Taiwanese officials, something that many of us find both insulting and counterproductive. I remember a number of years ago, about 26 of us, after votes on, I believe it was a Monday or Tuesday evening, flew all the way up to New York City to meet with President Chen, who was president of Taiwan at the time. Very inconvenient for us to have to fly all the way up there and come back here. These are self-imposed restrictions that we impose, the United States imposes. This policy is nonsense, should be changed. The fact that you can't have a president or vice president or foreign minister or the defense minister from Taiwan come here to our capital, Washington, is just, I think, crazy. Earlier this year, I expressed these concerns again after having said this to previous administrations, to Secretary of State Tillerson, and pointed out that this self-imposed restriction bars Taiwan officials from setting foot in this city, the center of democracy and freedom. This policy goes against our own self-interest. It tells China that we're willing to yield to them on our foreign policy issues such as this one. It conveys weakness, I think, to Beijing. China continues to take aggressive actions that further its long-running campaign to isolate Taiwan. And I believe that the United States has a legal and moral commitment, as we all know, to defend Taiwan's sovereignty in the face of this aggression from the PRC. The United States should have a direct dialogue with our democratically elected friend, the leadership in Taiwan, whichever party it happens to be. And it's time to change this outlandish policy and outdated policy. The Taiwan Travel Act will do this, and I would urge my colleagues to support this measure. And I'd also like to urge my colleagues to support an amendment that we'll be offering on H.R. 1698. It requires the President to notify Congress when there is credible information that Iran may be receiving large quantities of advanced conventional weapons from foreign countries. Going further, this amendment would also require the President to determine if such a weapons transfer should trigger further sanctions. Nearly 10 years ago, Russia signed a contract to sell several S-300 surface-to-air missile systems to Iran. In 2010, Russia suspended the sale only to renew the deal after the terms of the Iran deal was agreed to. And that wasn't a coincidence, I believe. The S-300 missile defense system strengthens Tehran's military capabilities, and it complicates our U.S. strategy for eliminating potential Iranian nuclear weapons. Now Moscow has delivered multiple S-300 delivery systems to Iran. It's dangerous. Should military action ever be required, we want to avoid that, obviously, if at all possible, just as we want to avoid military action with respect to North Korea, if at all possible. But to allow missile systems like these, which could jeopardize future American actions, again, if necessary, is just wrong. Late last month, Iran even displayed this surface-to-air missile system to the public, a move that was clearly designed to elevate tensions, to be more aggressive with the United States and with the West in general. We have to take action, I think, on this, and I think this legislation is a step in the right direction. Would urge folks to support that amendment and support the Taiwan Relations Act. And I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Bill Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the Chair and the Ranking Member for working together in a bipartisan way once again on these pieces of legislation. I think it's important. We're giving the Trump administration the tools that are necessary to use these sanctions as part of what I hope will become a comprehensive strategy that is currently lacking. I also must comment, because I think we're in the edge of something very dangerous, if indeed the briefing that the Republican members have received about the President's plans to fail to certify the Iran agreement, something he didn't share with us, is indeed true. This committee has worked hard to work together. We've worked hard to try and see what we could do to influence China in the short run to intercede in North Korea and to try and work in that regard. Failing to certify is going to, frankly, cause great damage in trying to get China to move, because we won't show the consistency and resolve necessary when we make an agreement to go forward. Secondly, I think for all of us that want to make sure that the agreement is aggressively enforced, this is going to weaken that effort, because it's going to make the coalition of allies that we've assembled to make it possible in the first place less cohesive. And without that cohesiveness, we won't be able to act as strongly and aggressively as we could otherwise to enforce this agreement. And my last point, Mr. Chairman, is this. If he goes ahead and fails to certify, as yesterday's testimony indicated to this committee, we'll be playing with fire. In that 60-day period, it's very likely, I believe, that there'll be some actors that will move for a major incident in the Middle East to try and provoke this Congress into acting in a way that will blow up that agreement and blow up the coalition that we have going forward. This period is essential, and I hope, should this happen, I hope the same feelings of bipartisan agreement, loyalty to our country, putting that first above all else, I hope that stays in force as we go forward for the entire Congress. We as a committee can demonstrate that should these things occur from outside malign actors, that we will stay together, we will not be moved, and get through this very dangerous period. So I want to congratulate this committee on working together once again, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. We now go to Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important markup. It's encouraging to see your bipartisan leadership with Ranking Member Elliott Engel. I'm grateful to be a supporter of H.R. 1698, the Iran Ballistic Missiles Sanctions Enforcement Act, as well as H.R. 535, the Taiwan Travel Act. Sponsored by Chairman Ed Royce, I appreciate being a co-sponsor of H.R. 1698, the Iran Ballistic Missiles and Sanctions Enforcement. This bipartisan bill works to expand sanctions on Iran with respect to their ballistic missile program and ultimately works to keep American families safe. I am also grateful to support, as a co-sponsor of H.R. 535, the Taiwan Travel Act, sponsored by our colleague, Congressman Steve Chabot, working to strengthen the relationship between the United States and Taiwan by encouraging officials of all levels from both countries to visit and meet with each other, and also motivates Taiwanese to promote business in the United States. my home state of South Carolina has benefited with the billion-dollar investment by Nanya Plastics, Formosa Plastics Group, in Lake City, South Carolina, which has created hundreds of jobs for American families. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. David Cicilline, Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for holding this markup today. I strongly support the Taiwan Travel Act and our efforts to recognize the important relationship between the United States and Taiwan. We're here on another issue of tremendous importance, Iran. Despite the President's treatment of the U.S. commitment to the Iran nuclear deal with this on-again, off-again, will he certify, will he not certify, as though it were a segment in a game show, this is not a trivial matter. We're talking about nuclear war, about a direct threat to our ally Israel, to the safety of the American men and women stationed in the Middle East, and of course our safety here at home. By threatening not to certify that Iran is in compliance with the JCPOA, without any evidence that they have violated the terms, and in fact broad agreement that Iran is complying with the terms of this of the JCPOA, including multiple sources that include the President's own senior officials, the President threatens to destroy the agreement that took decades to build. He threatens the credibility of the United States of America, he threatens our relationship with our allies, and he threatens our ability to mobilize support to combat Iran's many destabilizing activities throughout the region. And most importantly, he threatens to put Iran on a direct path toward a nuclear bomb. The Iran deal accomplished its objective, preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons. This is not to say that they are not engaged in destabilizing or aggressive conduct. Are they funding terrorism? Yes. Are they supporting Hezbollah and Hamas? Yes. Are they continuing to take American citizens hostage? Yes. These are all serious issues of vital importance that we need to focus on outside the terms of the JCPOA. The nuclear deal was never meant to combat the multitude of Iranian infractions of international law, but was meant to take the nuclear issue off the table so that we as an international community can focus our energies on tightening the cinch around Iran's illicit financial activities, against their terrorism, and against their egregious human rights abuses and other maligned activities both within Iran and elsewhere. As Jake Sullivan testified before this committee yesterday, the fabricated drama created by President Trump surrounding certification only draws attention away from the very issues we need to address most. So long as we're bickering with our allies and threatening to unilaterally pull out of the JCPOA, we give Iran cover for its bad behavior. If recent news reports are correct, President Trump seems to think that he can have his cake and eat it too. He seems to think that he can neglect to certify as required under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act and then kick the can to Congress and absolve himself from any leadership role on this critical issue, and he will create great uncertainty about the U.S. position. This would be a grave mistake. America must live up to its commitments. There's plenty of room to negotiate on the details that fall outside of the JCPOA. This is precisely what the JCPOA was intended to do, to give us room to focus on the very real and very serious issues of Iranian malfeasance. This is exactly what we must do. The U.S. must keep its commitment to our allies, maintain our compliance with the Iran nuclear deal, and most importantly, as our chairman so aptly put it, we must enforce the hell out of it. That is Congress's role, and it's up to us to ensure that we and our allies make clear to Iran that while we maintain enforcement of the JCPOA, we will hold them to task for their bad behavior elsewhere. And if they violate the terms of the JCPOA, we must do everything we can to reimpose sanctions and hold Iran accountable. And I sincerely hope that we never get to that point. But if we do, I know that I speak for many of my colleagues when I say we'll be the first in line to hold a hard line and reimpose sanctions. But for President Trump to pull out of the deal simply because he doesn't like it, because he campaigned against it, or because it will benefit him politically is the height of irresponsibility. I thank the chairman for bringing up legislation now and previously that will hold Iran accountable for its behavior. And I urge the administration to utilize the tools we are giving them to enforce sanctions against Iranian officials and businesses that violate international law. I think it's important to note that as of now, the administration has yet to impose any new sanctions based on the authorities we gave them this summer in H.R. 3364. This is inexcusable. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for your leadership, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Brian Mast of Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. I will keep my remarks brief. My thoughts on the JCPOA and the Iran deal are simple, and it's that it places about as much deterrence on Iran as putting a millionaire on house arrest while cutting them a check for billions of dollars at the same time. The fact is that Iran has done their absolute best to kill American service members in Iraq and Afghanistan. They are colonizing their way across the Middle East through their proxies. And discounting the fact that an ICBM is not the only way to deliver a nuclear payload, the reality is it can be dropped off of the belly of an aircraft, delivered by a submarine, shipped in a container, or placed on the back end of a truck. If we allow Iran the ability to deliver any payload to our shores by an ICBM, then this is an allowance that has occurred out of nothing more than fear and trepidation and weakness. These are things that Americans have never been and should never be defined by, and we should not start that today. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. Any other members? Lois, Mr. Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our ranking member. Thank you for these bipartisan bills, which I support both of them. I say today is a tale of two countries. Taiwan is a great friend, a great trading partner, very culturally enriched, and incidentally just elected its first woman president, which I congratulate them for. Iran, on the other hand, is not a friend. They are the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. And I am very pleased to also support this ballistic missile bill. With all that said, I'm going to try to restrain myself because my colleagues have been very, I think, polite. They've used the word dangerous, irresponsible. I want to say that, in my opinion, that the failure to certify at this point in time that Iran is meeting its obligations under the JCPOA is a manufactured crisis by the White House. It's based upon fake news, and it's an action that would be opposed by our allies who went along with the agreement, and reportedly opposed by the President's own national security team. Now, like others up here, originally I opposed the Iran agreement for a number of reasons. I won't get into it today. That was then. That now is now because we've already released over $100 billion worth of assets. All reports and agreed upon by our international partners is that Iran has been complying with the agreement. So to me, it would be totally insane, really, to leave this agreement now. There are other issues I know we all are concerned about, and we obviously need to continue to enforce the agreement. We need to try to stop Iran's terrorist activities. But this is not the way to do it by decertifying the agreement or the compliance with the agreement. You know, the President made a lot of campaign promises that some of us disagreed with. And to me, a lot of his actions have been destructive against women, destructive against the environment, destructive against immigrants. But to me, this is a new level of potential destruction because we're talking about our very existence. And now, to me, using a nuclear war as fulfilling a campaign promise. So I hope, although I don't expect that the President is going to back down from his campaign promise, but I do hope and expect that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are going to show some restraint and reasonableness because there's too much at stake. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We go to Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, the rhetoric here is disturbing. I mean, I think I just heard someone suggest that if the Iranians were aggressive with nuclear weapons, it was the responsibility of President Trump, the destruction that might follow. If Vandenberg, who said politics should stop at the water's edge, were here, I imagine he'd roll over in his proverbial grave. A couple of things have been said. Failure to certify, quote, won't show the consistency of resolve to move forward, unquote. No, I think it would show greater resolve to deter Iran, who's been very clear in their rhetoric, from not only producing nuclear weapons, but also, and quite importantly, delivery mechanisms. In 1994, President Clinton stood before the nation to trumpet the North Korean nuclear deal, which was followed with billions and billions of dollars in aid and assets transferred to North Korea, and President Clinton essentially declared that there was an end to the nuclear threat from North Korea as a result of that wonderful agreement. Fast forward 23 years, and here we sit. Google it. And so another one of my colleagues and friends suggested that if we don't do this, that we're kicking the can, or if the President were to decertify, that he would be kicking the can to Congress. I would offer that the only can kicking going on here is of a nation that won't take the mullahs at their word. I pointed out yesterday that this is a regime that's burned the effigy of every single United States president since Jimmy Carter, and indeed during the finalization of the framework for the JCPOA, depicted a lynching of our first African-American president. Google it. And so they've demonstrated repeatedly through act and word a desire to eradicate this nation, the United Kingdom, the Israelis, amongst others, from existence. We have history as a teacher where we plied the North Koreans with billions of dollars, and the President of the United States declared the nuclear threat from the region to be gone. Fast forward to the current events of today. Now we've plied the Iranians with the freeing of billions of dollars of assets and literally pallets of cash money. And we're told that the JCPOA is somehow sacrosanct and beyond reproach. Let me point out, probably for at least the 10th time in this committee, that the UN Security Council Resolution 1929 from 2010, prior to the JCPOA, articulated that Iran shall not undertake activities to develop ballistic missiles capable of delivering a nuclear payload. Shall not. The JCPOA, this document that we would think was somehow the be-all, end-all that would secure our future forever, and if this administration questions the policies of the last administration, might lead to the greatest destruction. That hyperbole needs to stop because it's dangerous, candidly, to how we treat each other as Americans, is somehow sacrosanct. The JCPOA is worded such as Iran is called upon not to undertake ballistic missile testing. Again, shall not undertake 2010 UN Security Council, which means the Chinese and the Russians and the world agreed to it, is called upon not to undertake JCPOA 2015, drafted while they're burning our president in effigy and depicting him being hung. And there's a hue and cry that somehow pointing out flaws in this document, admitting that there might have been mistakes, is wrong. Mr. Sullivan yesterday, who something might have been National Security Advisor had the result of the last elections been different, said diplomacy requires compromise. I wonder if he was quoting Neville Chamberlain circa 1938. Because the Treaty of Versailles called on the Nazis not to develop an army greater than 100,000 soldiers, and several million soldiers and millions of dead innocent people later, we learned that sometimes parties who enter into treaties don't honor them. Winston Churchill said appeasement means feeding the crocodile and hoping he'll eat you last. I'd hearken back to the statement that we might be kicking the can to Congress by pointing out flaws in the JCPOA to suggest that the only can kicking going on now is kicking the can of a nuclear threat to our children down the road, just like was done by the Clinton administration in the 1990s when they declared an end to the threat from that region. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Tom. We go to Mr. Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, thank you for introducing H.R. 1968. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this legislation and a proponent of doing everything in our power to curb and put an end to Iran's malign behavior. The Iran Ballistic Missile and International Sanctions Enhancement Act does just that. It would impose sanctions on those who support Iran's ballistic missile program and transfer weapons to and from Iran. Iran is a bad actor in a volatile region, and its agents continue to sow instability. That is why I offered an amendment to require a report containing information on any credible information regarding violations of the travel restrictions on sanctioned Iranian individuals per UN Security Council Resolution 2231, and any exemptions that have been approved by the Security Council. There are troubling reports that Iran's commander of the IRGC Quds Force, General Qasem Soleimani, has traveled to Russia in violation of UNSCR 2231. These travel restrictions were put in place for good reason, and we deserve to know whether, in fact, violations have occurred. I would like to thank the Chairman for including my amendment in the en bloc package. I would also like to note that while I oppose the JCPOA, now that it is in place, I believe we have to aggressively and rigorously enforce it. But as we enforce it, it is critically vital to acknowledge that the JCPOA, like any agreement, has inherent risks, and that this deal in particular has serious shortcomings and gaps, including, but not limited to, the sunset provisions. The urgent responsibility of our government, in conjunction with our partners and our allies, is to develop the comprehensive strategies and commit the necessary resources to work to close the gaps and reduce the risks. I believe we must clearly and fully articulate, as a matter of national policy, that the United States will never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and that we will aggressively work to confront Iran's malign activities in the region and around the world. I applaud this committee for its work to reduce Iran's malign activities and prevent Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Any other members seeking recognition?
Oh, wait, Mr. Esbiot.
Mr. Esbiot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my first year in Congress. Had I been here when this agreement would have been reached, I probably would have looked at it with a great deal of speculation and concern, as I felt perhaps it was not as strong as it should have been, but it is what it is. And today we see how over 402 site visits and 25 snapped inspections were conducted in the 12 months of 2016, almost doubling from 212, or just slightly over 200 visits. Inspections were conducted on 213, also over 200, on 214 over 350, as well as 215, and as I said, in 2016, 412 inspections were conducted, all leading to what conclusion, and that is that they have been in compliance. Now, yesterday we heard from General Wall, who said that he felt almost 99% sure that they were cheating on the agreement. And I'm substantiated allegation that I think is irresponsible at the very least. And so all important players in this endeavor, particularly the inspectors, are saying that they're in compliance of the JCPOA. And so whereas the agreement perhaps was not strong enough to include other areas of concern for America, Iran's missile program, and other important factors that must be addressed, the experts have told us time and time again, not only in the past administration, but in this administration, that they have been in compliance. So the agreement also came about as a result of coalition building with other important allies that we have across the world. And we have a certain responsibility towards those allies to ensure that they don't feel in the future when we need them again, let's say, for example, with North Korea, that they will be left out in the cold after they reach an agreement. They sacrificed, or they were flexible in conceding certain things that may have been dear and near to them. So I think that we should continue to push forward to ensure that we hold Iran's feet to the fire, that some of these issues that were left out of the agreement should be dealt with by the same international community and the same coalition that we help lead. So we cannot abdicate our leadership role in that coalition. It is important that America continues to be the leader of the world. And so we must continue to strengthen that agreement and discuss the particular issues that are very concerning to all of us in the future. I join Ranking Member Elliot Engels in supporting the concept that we got to strengthen this, but at this point, it will be political malpractice, if you may, if we opt out. We will feel the concern and scorn in many cases of our allies, and I think we will put the world in peril.
Thank you, Mr. Espiat. Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on the items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The measures considered en bloc are agreed to. Without objection, the measures considered en bloc are ordered favorably reported as amended. Staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and the chair is authorized to seek House consideration under suspension of the rules. Yes,
yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Engel.
Just two quick things. I first want to, I know we all want to wish Mr. Connolly a speedy recovery. He had an accident, and he is being wheelchaired around in a wheelchair, and wish him a speedy recovery. And the second important thing is happy birthday, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Engel. Appreciate that. Well, thank you. On that high note, that concludes our business for today. And so I want to thank all of the members of this committee and you as well, Mr. Engel, for your contributions and assistance with this markup. The committee is adjourned.